I don't really know where to begin. This is a pivotal point in mortals' history. It's different. It feels different. The one thing that I love about human beings the most is its capacity for good. And the things that I hate about human beings the most are their capacity for hate. But I'm glad that there are human beings out there that are saying enough is enough. And they won't take the systematic oppression that has been existing in one of their countries, probably most of their countries, for hundreds of years. Every human being is equal. Every single one. So for those of you who are here for a story today, you'll get one. But I wouldn't be a mortal studies major without addressing what's happening in the mortal world today. It's time human beings stand up for each other. Really stand up for each other. And I'm so proud of the people that are. And I'm so proud of the people that are giving their money to notable causes, and to those that are having the hard conversations with their friends, family members, and strangers. Because it does make the world a better place. And those conversations need to happen. And that money needs to be spent. So, welcome to Storytime with Sid. I hope all of you are staying healthy and safe right now. Today, the story on the docket is called The Snow Queen. Now, The Snow Queen is a story in several parts, so there's 7 stories within The Snow Queen, and I'm going to be breaking it up into part 1 and part 2. The beautiful thing about this story is that it is so different, and I am excited for you to listen to it. So, this is The Snow Queen, a tale in 7 stories, part 1. The first story, which is about the mirror and its pieces. Alright, now let's begin. When we reach the end of the story, we'll know more than we know now. Because there was an evil troll, and he was the very worst. He was a devil. And one day, when he was in a truly good mood, because he had created a mirror that had the power to make everything good and beautiful that was reflected in it to shrink to almost nothing, while whatever was worthless and loathsome would stand out clearly and look even worse. Gross. In the mirror, the loveliest landscape looked like boiled spinach, and the best people turned beastly or stood on their heads with no stomachs. Their faces became so distorted that they were beyond recognition, and if you had a freckle, you could be sure that it would spread all over your nose and your mouth and all over your body. Not that freckles are bad, but people like to focus on the things that they don't like about themselves. And so the point of this is that if you see one thing you don't like about yourself, it's going to manifest everywhere, because the point of this mirror is to exploit the fears of human beings. That was an excellent fun, said the devil. If a good pious thought passed through someone's mind, a smirk would appear in the mirror, and the troll demon would have to laugh at his ingenious invention. Everyone who attended troll school, because he ran a troll school, told everyone else that a miracle had occurred. For the first time, they said, it was possible to see how the world and human beings actually looked. They ran around with the mirror, and in the end, there wasn't a country or a person that hadn't been distorted by it. Then, they even wanted to fly up to heaven itself to ridicule the angels and our Lord. The higher they flew at the mirror, the more it smirked. They could hardly hold on to it. Higher and higher they flew, closer to God and the angels. Then the mirror began trembling, so terribly as it smirked that it flew out of their hands and plummeted to earth, where it broke into 100 million billion pieces and more. And that was precisely the reason why it did even more harm than before, because some of the pieces were hardly bigger than a Some of the pieces were hardly bigger than a grain of sand. They flew around in the wide world, and whenever they landed in someone's eye, That's where they would stay. Then those people would see everything wrong, or only had eyes for what was bad in something, since every little speck of mirror had kept the same power as the whole mirror possessed. Some people even got a little piece of a mirror in their heart, and then it was quite dreadful. The heart would turn into a lump of ice. Some pieces of the mirror were so big that they were used for window panes, and it wasn't worth looking through those panes to see your friends. Other pieces ended up in eyeglasses, and then things would go badly when people put on the glasses to see properly and fairly. The evil one laughed until his belly split. It tickled him so splendidly. But outside, little pieces of glass were still flying around in the air. Now let's hear what happened. The second story is about a little boy and a little girl. In the big city, where there are so many buildings and people that there isn't room enough for everyone to have a little garden, and where most people have to be content with flowers in pots, there were two poor children who did have a garden that was slightly bigger than a flower pot. They were not brother and sister, yet they were fond of each other as if they had been. Their families lived right next door to each other, and they lived in two garret rooms. At the place where the roof of one building touched the roof of the other, and the gutter ran along the eaves, a little window jutted out from each building. All you had to do was step over the gutter to go from one window to another. Outside, each family had a big wooden box, and in it grew herbs for cooking and a little rose bush. There was one in each box, and they grew so wondrously. Then their parents decided to set the boxes atop the gutter so they almost reached from one window to the other and looked exactly like the two flower beds. Pea vines hung down from the sides of the boxes, and rose bushes sprouted along branches that twined around the windows and bent towards each other. It was almost like a triumphal arc of greenery and blossoms, since the boxes were quite high, and the children knew that they weren't supposed to crawl out. They were often allowed to climb out the windows to each other and sit on their little stools behind the roses, and that's where they played so happily. In the winter, of course, that amusement would come to an end. The windows were so often completely frosted over, but then they would heat up, and copper skillings on the stove place hot skillings on the frozen window pane, and then a lovely peephole would appear, so round, that though a blessed and gentle eye would peek, one in each window, it was a little boy and a little girl. His name was Kai, and hers was Gerda. In the summer they could reach each other with a single bound. In the winter they first had to go down all those stairs and up those other stairs. Outside, the snow drifted in swirls. "The white bees are swarming," said the old grandmother. "Do they have a queen bee too?" asked the little boy, because he knew the real bees had one. "Yes, they do," said the grandmother. "She flies in the thick of the swarm. She's the biggest of them all, and she never rests on the ground. She flies up at once inside the black cloud. Many a winter night she flies through the city streets, peering in windows, and then they frost over so strangely, looking like flowers." "Oh, yes, we've seen that," said both children, so they knew it must be true. "Can the Snow Queen come inside?" asked the little girl. "Just let her come," said the boy, "and I'll put her on the hot stove, and then she'll melt." But grandmother stroked his hair and told them other stories. One evening, when little Kai was home and almost undressed, he climbed onto the chair by the window and peeked at the little hole. A few snowflakes were falling outside, and one of them, the biggest of all, remained lying on the edge of one of the flower boxes. The snowflake grew bigger and bigger until it became at last a whole woman, dressed in the sheerest white gossamer, which looked as if it was millions of starlight flakes. She was so beautiful and elegant, but made of ice, dazzling, glittering ice, and yet she was alive. Her eyes stared like two bright stars, but there was nothing calm or peaceful about them. She nodded at the window and waved her hand. The little boy was terrified and jumped down from the chair. Then it seemed as if a huge bird flew past the window outside. The next day was bright and cold, and then came spring. The sun shone, green sprouts appeared, and swallows built their nests. The windows were flung open, and the little children once again sat in their tiny garden high up in the eaves at the very top of the buildings. That summer the roses bloomed so marvelously. The little girl had learned a hymn that spoke of roses, and the roses made her think of her own. She sang it for the little boy, and he sang along. "In the valley where the roses grow wild, there we will speak to the Christ child." And the children held each other's hands, kissed the roses, and looked into God's bright sunshine, speaking to it as if Christ child were there. How lovely the summer days were. How heavenly it was to be outside near the fresh rose bushes that never seemed to stop blooming. Kai and Gerda sat looking at a picture book with animals and birds. That was when, just as the clock struck 5 on the big church tower, Kai said, "Ow! Something stabbed me in the heart. And now I have something in my eye." The little girl put an arm around his neck. He blinked his eyes. No, there was nothing to be seen. "I think it's gone," he said. But it was not gone. It was one of those specks of glass that came from the mirror. The troll mirror. Of course we remember it, the horrid glass that made everything great and good that was reflected in it become small and hideous. While the evil and wicked appeared quite clearly, and every fault that possessed was noticed at once. Poor Kai. He had also gotten a speck right in his heart, which would soon turn to a lump of ice. At the moment it didn't hurt, but it was there. "Why are you crying?" he asked. "It makes you look so horrid. There's nothing wrong with me. Ugh!" he suddenly shouted. "That rose over there has been gnawed by a worm, and look, that one is completely crooked. These roses are actually quite disgusting. They look like boxes they're standing in." And then he kicked the box hard with one foot and tore off 2 of the roses. "Kai, what are you doing?" cried the little girl. And when he saw her horror, he tore off another rose and then dashed through his window away from the blessed little Gerda. Later, when she brought out the picture book, he said that it was for babies, and if grandmother told them stories, he would always come with some objection. Whenever he had the chance, he would walk behind her, putting on glasses, talking the way she did. It was a perfect likeness, and then people would laugh at him. Soon he could walk and talk like everyone on the whole street. Everything that was odd about them and unattractive, Kai could imitate. Then people said, "He certainly has a clever head on his shoulders, that boy." But it was the glass that landed in his eye, and the glass that sat in his heart. They were the reason he teased even little Gerda, who loved him with all of her soul. The games he played were now very different from before. They were so logical. One winter day, as the snowflakes swirled in drifts, he brought out a magnifying glass, held out a corner of his blue coat, and let the flakes land on it. "Look into the glass, Gerda," he said, and every snowflake grew much bigger. It looked like a magnificent flower or a 10-pointed star. It was lovely to see. "Do you see how ingenious they are?" said Kai. "They're much more interesting than real flowers, and none of them has a single flaw. They're quite perfect as long as they don't melt." A little while later, Kai appeared wearing big gloves and carrying his sled on his back. He shouted right into Gerda's ear, "I have permission to go sledding at the big square where the others are playing." And off he went. Over in the square, the most daring of the boys would often tie their sleds to the farmer's wagon, and then they would ride along for a good stretch down the road. They were having a merry time. In the midst of their games, a huge sled appeared. It was painted all white, and in it sat someone swathed in a shaggy white fur and wearing a shaggy white cap. The sleigh circled the square twice, and Kai quickly tied his little sled to it, and then he was riding along. The sleigh went faster and faster right to the next street. The person who was driving turned around and nodded in such a friendly way at Kai as if they knew each other. Each time Kai tried to untie his little sled, the person would nod again, and then Kai stayed where he was. They drove right out through the city gates. Then the snow began to come down so heavily that the little boy couldn't even see his hand in front of him, but he kept racing along. He hastily let go of the rope to get away from the huge sleigh, but it did no good. His little sled hung on, moving with the speed of the wind. Then he shouted quite loudly, but no one heard him. The snow swirled in drifts, and the sleigh sped along. Once in a while it would give a hop, as if flying over ditches and fences. Kai was quite terrified. He wanted to say the Lord's Prayer, but all he could remember were his multiplication tables. The snowflakes grew bigger and bigger until at last they looked like big white hens. Suddenly they leaped aside. The huge sleigh came to a halt, and the person who was driving it stood up. The fur coat and the cap were nothing but snow. It was a woman, standing so tall and straight and shimmering white. It was the Snow Queen. "We've made good progress," she said. "But aren't you freezing? Crawl under my bearskin." And she set him in the sleigh beside her, wrapping the bearskin around him. He felt as if he were sinking into a snowdrift. "Are you still freezing?" she asked. and then she kissed him on the forehead. Ooh, it was colder than ice. It went right to his heart, which was already half ice. He felt as if he would die, but only for a moment, and then he felt fine. He no longer noticed the cold all around him. My sled! Don't forget my sled! That was the first thing he thought of, and so it was tied onto one of the white hens, which flew along behind the sled on its back. The Snow Queen kissed Kai again, and then he forgot all about little Gerda and grandmother and everyone else back home. No more kisses for you, she said, or I might kiss you to death. Kai looked at her. She was so beautiful. He couldn't imagine a wiser, lovelier face. She no longer seemed made of ice, as she had when she sat outside the window and beckoned to him. To his eyes she now seemed perfect. He was not the least bit afraid. He told her that he would do his figures in his head even with fractions, or how many square miles each country had, and how many inhabitants, and she kept on smiling. He then thought that what he knew was not nearly enough. He looked up at the vast, vast sky, and she flew along with him, flew high up into the black cloud, and the storm rumbled and roared as if it were singing ancient ballads. They flew over forests and lakes and over sea and land. Beneath them rushed the cold wind. The wolves howled and the snow sparkled, and over it flew shrieking black crows. But up above, the moon glowed big and bright, and Kai gazed at it all night, that long, long winter night. In the daytime, he slept at the Snow Queen's feet. The third story, The Flower Garden and the Woman Who Knew Magic. But how did little Gerda feel when Kai didn't come back? Where was he? No one knew, and no one could tell her. The boys said only that they'd seen him tie his little sled to a magnificent huge sleigh that drove down the street and out of the city gates. No one knew where he was. Many tears fell. Little Gerda wept so hard and so long. Then they said that he was dead. He had drowned in the river that ran close to the city. Oh, those were long and dark winter days. Then came spring, with warmer sunshine. Kai is dead and gone, said little Gerda. I don't believe it, said the sunshine. He's dead and gone, she told the swallows. We don't believe it, they replied, and in the end, Gerda didn't believe it either. I'll put on my new red shoes, she said one morning. Kai has never seen them, and then I'll go down to the river and ask about him. It was very early. She kissed old grandmother who was sleeping, put on her red shoes, and walked out the gates to the river. Is it true that if you've taken my little playmate, I'll give you my red shoes if you give them back to me? She asked the river. And it seemed to hear her, that the waves nodded quite strangely. Then she picked up her red shoes, her dearest possessions, and threw them both into the river. But they fell close to shore, and the little waves promptly brought them back to her own land, as if the river didn't want to take her dearest possessions, since it didn't have little Kai. But she thought that she hadn't thrown them far enough, so she climbed into a boat that was floating among the reeds, and she went all the way out to the farthest end and threw the shoes. But the boat wasn't tied securely, and with her movement it glided away from land. She noticed this and hurried to get out, but before she could make her way back, the boat was more than 2 feet from shore, and it began to slip away even faster. Then little Gerda grew quite frightened and started to cry, but no one heard her except the sparrows. They couldn't carry her back to land, but they flew along the shore and sang as if to comfort her. Here we are, here we are. The boat drifted with the current, and little Gerda sat quite still in her stocking feet. Her little red shoes floated along behind, but they couldn't reach the boat. It was picking up speed. It was beautiful on both banks, with lovely flowers, old trees, and sheep and cows on the slopes. But not one person in sight. Maybe the river will take me to little Kai, thought Gerda. And then her spirits rose. She stood up for many hours, looked at the beautiful green banks, then she came to a big cherry orchard. There stood a little house that had strange red and blue windows, as well as a thatched roof. Outside stood 2 wooden soldiers who presented arms for all who sailed past. Gerda called to them. She thought they were alive, but of course they didn't answer. She came quite close to them, and the river lifted the boat towards land. Gerda shouted even louder. Then out of the house came an old woman leaning on a crooked stick. She was wearing a big sun hat painted with the loveliest flowers. "You poor little child," said the old woman. "How did you end up in the big strong current drifting far out to the wide world?" And then the old woman came right out to the water, hooked her cricket stick on the boat, pulled it ashore, and lifted out little Gerda. Gerda was glad to be on dry land, yet she was a little afraid of the strange old woman. "Come here and tell me who you are and how you happened to get here," she said. Gerda told her everything, and the old woman shook her head and said, "My, my." After Gerda had told her everything and asked her whether she had seen little Kai, the woman said that she had not come past, but no doubt he would. She shouldn't be so sad, but have a taste of her cherries and look at her flowers. They were more beautiful than any picture book. Each of them could tell a whole story. And then she took Gerda by the hand. They went inside the little house, and the old woman locked the door. The windows were high up with panes that were red, blue, and yellow. The daylight shone so strangely inside from all those colors. On the table there were the loveliest cherries, and Gerda ate as many as she liked because she was no longer afraid. While she ate, the old woman combed her hair with a golden comb. Her hair curled and gleamed such a lovely color around her face, which was so round and looked like a rose. "Oh, how I've longed for such a sweet little girl," said the old woman. "Now you'll see. Well, the two of us, we will get along." And she combed little Gerda's hair. Gerda forgot more and more about Kai, who was like a brother, because the old woman knew magic, although she was not a bad witch. Because keep in mind, there are good witches and there are bad witches. She wasn't a bad witch. She merely did a little conjuring for her own amusement, and now she wanted to keep little Gerda. That's why she went into the garden, stretched out her cricket stick towards all the rose bushes, and no matter how lovely their blossoms, every one of them sank into the black earth. It was impossible to tell where they had stood. The old woman that was afraid that when Gerda saw the roses she would think about her own, remember little Kai, and run off. Then she led Gerda out to the flower garden. Oh, what a fragrance and loveliness there was! Every imaginable flower from every season of the year stood there in full bloom. No picture book could be more colorful or more beautiful. Gerda jumped for joy and played in the sun until it went down around the cherry trees. Then she was given a lovely bed with red silk comforters filled with blue violets, and she slept and dreamed as blissfully as any queen on her wedding day. The next day she played again with the flowers in the warm sunshine, and that manner many days passed. Gerda knew every flower, but no matter how many there were, she still thought that one must be missing, though she didn't know which it might be. Then one day she was sitting and looking into the old woman's sun hat with the painted flowers, and the most beautiful of all was a rose. The old woman had forgotten to remove it from her hat when she put the others in the ground. That's what happens when you don't have your wits about you. "What?" said Gerda. "Aren't there any roses here?" And she leaped among the flower beds, searching and searching, but there was not one to be found. Then she sat down and wept, but her hot tears fell on the very spot where the rose bush had vanished. When the hot tears watered the earth, the bush suddenly shot up, full of blossoms where it sank. Gerda embraced the bush, kissed the roses, and thought about the lovely roses back home, and then about little Kai. "Oh, how long I've lingered," said the little girl. "I was supposed to find Kai." "Do any of you know where he is?" she asked the roses. "Do you think he's dead and gone?" "Well, he's not dead," said the roses. "We've been in the ground where all the dead are, but Kai wasn't there." "Oh, thank you," said little Gerda, and she went over to the other flowers and looked inside their chalices and asked, "Do you know where little Kai is?" But each flower stood in the sun dreaming of its own tale or story. Little Gerda heard so many of them, but no one knew anything about Kai. What did the fire lily say? "Do you hear the drum? Bam, bam! It only has 2 beats, always bam, bam! Listen to the women's mournful song. Listen to the shouts of the priests. In her long red gown the Hindu woman stands on the pyre. The flames leap up around her and her dead husband. But the Hindu woman is thinking of the man who is alive here in the crowd, the man whose eyes burn hotter than flames, the man whose fiery eyes reach deeper into the hearts than the blaze that will soon burn her body to ashes. Can the flame of the heart die in the flames of the pyre?" "I don't understand that at all," said little Gerda. That's my tale, said the fire lily. But what does the morning glory say? Above the narrow mountain road perches an old baronial castle. The dense periwinkles twine around the ancient red walls, leaf upon leaf over to the balcony. That's where a lovely girl stands. She's bending over the railing and gazing down the road. No rose hangs fresher from its branch than she. No apple blossom, when the wind lifts it from the tree, floats lighter than she. How her magnificent silk gown rustles. Will he never come? Is Kai the one you mean? Asked little Gerda. I'm only telling you my tale, my dream, replied the morning glory. What does the little snowdrop say? Between the trees, a long board hangs from the ropes. It's a swing. Two charming little girls, their dresses as white as snow, long green silk ribbons fluttering from their hats, are sitting there, swinging. Their brother, who's bigger than they are, is standing on the swing. He has one arm hooked around the rope to hold on, because in one hand he has a little pole, and in the other a clay pipe. He's blowing soap bubbles. The swing sways, the bubbles fly with lovely shifting colors. The last one is still clinging to the stem of the pipe, quivering in the wind. The swing sways. The little black dog, as light as bubbles, stands on his hind legs to get up to the swing. The swing flies. The dog falls, barking and angry. They're teasing him. The bubbles burst. A swinging board, a leaping forth picture. That's my song. Your story may be a beautiful one, but you tell it so mournfully, and you didn't talk about little Kai at all. What do the hyacinths say? There were 3 lovely sisters, so transparent and so delicate. The gown of one sister was red, and the second sister's was blue, and the third sister's was pure white. Hand in hand they danced in the quiet lake in the bright moonlight. They were not elf girls, they were human children. There was such a sweet fragrance, and the girls disappeared into the forest. The fragrance grew stronger. 3 coffins, in which the lovely girls lay, glided from the depths of the forest across the lake. Shimmering fireflies flitted around in tiny, hovering lights. Are the dancing girls asleep, or are they dead? The fragrance of flowers say that they are corpses. The evening bell tolls for the dead. You make me sad, said little Gerda. Your fragrance is so strong that it makes me think of the dead girls. Oh, is little Kai dead after all? The roses were inside the earth, and they say no. Ding dong, rang the bell of the hyacinths. We're not ringing for little Kai. We don't know him at all. We're just singing our song, and only one we know. And Gerda went over to the buttercup, and the buttercup shone so beautifully, and it looked back at Gerda. What song would the buttercup sing? But it was not about Kai either. In a little courtyard shone our Lord's sun, so warm on the first day of spring. Its rays lit down the white wall of the neighbor's house. Close it grew, the first yellow flowers, gleaming in gold in the warm sunshine. The old grandmother was sitting outside in her chair. Her granddaughter, the poor enchanting servant girl, had come home for a short visit. She kissed her grandmother. There was gold, the heart's gold, that blessed the kiss. Gold on her lips, gold in the ground, gold up above in the morning hour. See, that's my little story, said the buttercup. Poor old grandmother, sighed Gerda. Oh, she must miss me. She must be grieving for me, just as she did for little Kai. But soon I'll go back home. I'll bring Kai with me. It's no use asking the flowers. They only know their own songs. They can't tell me anything. Then she tucked up her little dress so she could run over faster. But the narcissus struck her across the leg, and she jumped over it. She stopped, looked at the tall yellow flower, and asked, "Do you happen to know anything?" She bent all the way down to the narcissus, and what does it say? "I can see myself! I can see myself!" said the narcissus. "Oh, how fragrant I am! Up in the tiny garret room stands a little dancer half-dressed. She stands first on one leg, then on two. She kicks at the whole world. She's just an illusion. She pours water from the teapot onto a piece of cloth she's holding. It's a corset. Cleanliness is a good thing. The white dress hangs on a hook. It too has been washed, and the teapot dried on the roof. She puts it on, and the saffron yellow scarf around her neck makes the dress shine even whiter. Her leg is in the air. See how proudly she sways on the stalk. I can see myself. I can see myself!" "I don't like that one bit," said Gerda. "What kind of story is that?" And she ran to the edge of the garden. The door was closed, but she wiggled the rusty latch until it came loose and the door flew open. Then little Gerda ran barefoot out into the wide world. She looked back 3 times, but no one came after her. At last she could run no further and sat down on a big rock. When she looked around, summer was over. It was late autumn. She hadn't noticed at all in the tiny, lovely garden where the sun always shone and there were flowers from every season of the year. "Dear God, how long have I lingered?" said little Gerda. "It's already fall. There's no time to rest." And she stood up to go. Oh, how tender and sore were her little feet, and everything around her looked cold and raw. The long willow leaves had turned quite yellow, and the drops of fog dripped down from them. One leaf fell after another. Only the blackthorn still bore fruit, tart enough to pucker your lips. Oh, how gray and dreary it was in the wide world. And that is where we are going to start with the Snow Queen, Part 1. I find the story interesting that it is so easy for humans to see all the bad in the world. I don't know if what's going on in the world is because of a magical mirror landing in someone's eye or landing in someone's heart. I don't think it can be explained away just like that. But I do think that there is some kind of sadness and a sickness in someone that only sees the negative in the world and will take the beautiful things about people and tear them down. Every single person on this earth is beautiful and has a beautiful soul. And it's so easy to get distracted and lose sight of that. Whether that's from how you were raised to glass falling in your eye and distorting your vision of the world. But it's time to unlearn all of those negative things that were either taught to you or shown you in the world and get back to a pure, loving, understanding heart. I think that's important for human beings. And that's the power that human beings have, is their marvelous capacity for good. Thank you so much for watching today. And I hope everyone who watches and everyone else in the world is staying happy, healthy, and safe. Thank you so much, and have a good day.